All right, Harry, we are live, and it is the morning after the election. Welcome to day 2 of election 2020. I'm Flip Pideaux. Thanks for joining us here at Old Bull TV once again. And we have got a lot to sift through today. And here to help me do that is once again Harry Crane, professor of statistics at Rutgers University and co-founder of the decentralized research and publishing platform Researchers.one. Harry, thanks for joining us again. How are you today?
I'm good. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you could join us again on this, eventful second day. And I guess the big question is, what happened? We've been confidently assured by people whose profession it is to forecast elections that prediction markets that have been consistently showing a very close race and even a possible Trump win were insane, MAGA deranged buffoons who didn't understand the nuances of probabilistic forecasting, and an insult to the esteemed world of data journalism that had assured us a Biden blowout or something close to it was in the cards. I mean, we're supposed to be looking at 350, even more, upwards of 400 electoral votes, much larger polling lead than Clinton ever had. Texas was in play, Iowa was in play, Ohio was in play. So what happened?
First, on that note, we're still trying to figure that out. I mean, right, because there are still, as I see, 5 big states still out there, and I guess if they could all, in principle, right, go Biden, and then there might be a little bit more argument there's going to be some argument either way of who was right and who was wrong. But certainly, I don't think it was the landslide that a lot of people were predicting. I don't think this was the Mayweather-McGregor that some were comparing to, and I think what happened is, well, at least it seems right as of now that the national polls were off by quite a bit, of quite a few percentage points. I don't know exactly where that number is going to fall. I guess it could come all the way back down depending on where the votes are coming from, but last I saw, it was around 5% off from the projections, and that'll probably shrink back down a few points into maybe the 4% range or so. So the national polls being off by 4% is pretty big. And I think, we have to then ask, well, what's to make of the polls? Were the polls right? Were the polls wrong? I think a lot of indications that there was something missing from the polls, at least in key states.
Yeah.
Ohio, for example, I think Ohio, Florida, were 2 big ones that I think the polls missed by quite a bit.
Yeah, and we're going to get deeper into the polls and the specific state-by-state errors in a minute. I want to share my screen here briefly, though, to get people up to speed with how things are looking on the national map. And as you can see, we're currently traders are forecasting 290 electoral votes for Biden to Trump's 248. And interestingly, this has been right where the markets have had this race for days, if not weeks, 290 to 248. A couple of these have switched back and forth, North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, but 290, 248 has been pretty consistent. And so it's in some sense a validation of the markets. We talked yesterday about where the market's seeing something that the pollsters and the forecasters weren't. It seems that the answer is yes, but again, we'll get into that a little bit deeper in a minute, but just sort of looking at the pathways that remain here. And I want to refresh this too, because I'm not sure if the EV count is exactly lining up with the shading of the states. Yeah, here we go. So this 290 implies that Georgia is held by Trump, and without it, it flips back, I think, to 306. Yeah, because Georgia is 16. So that seems sort of like the upper bound for Biden is going to be 306. He'd be at 290 if Trump holds Georgia. He goes down to 270 if Trump pulls it out in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's been a little bit all over the map. We knew going into Election Day that they were going to be a lot slower to count all the votes. But say Trump does pull Pennsylvania back, that gives Biden 270 to Trump's 268. So that's obviously a tantalizingly close race. And so for Trump then to pull it out, he's got to rescue one of 4 states that are not, clearly going to go for Biden. You got Michigan is at 90 cents. Wisconsin's at 90 cents. Arizona, which was somewhat controversially called very early last night for Biden is at 89. And similarly, you've got Nevada. It's actually the softest one for Biden at this point at 86 cents. Obviously, if Trump gets Pennsylvania, gets to 268, any of those four flipping to Trump would give him a second term. And, accordingly, you see here in the pricing, 87 Biden to 15 Trump. So, Biden now a very heavy favorite. But Trump still with a shot here. Obviously, we don't really know exactly what's going on in Wisconsin and Michigan with the remaining counts. What's still left outstanding? Obviously, out west, there's still a little bit of a question too. But really, for Trump to have any prayer, he's got to figure out a way to win in Pennsylvania. So we'll have to see how that fleshes out over the remainder of the day, possibly the remainder of the week. Any of these states particularly surprise you before we get into a deeper look at the polling here?
Well, I don't know that anything surprises me. Then again, I didn't really have a concrete expectation. It's one of the things we talked about yesterday as to where things ended before yesterday, before the election, and then how things were going to transpire over the course of the day. That's something that I know very little about in a normal situation, but in this year especially, it's something that I think was one of the big unknowns, and that's where the intraday or the live trading. Curious, in terms of how that, who are trading those markets are definitely looking into that and how they're dealing with that. To some extent, what might have been a little bit surprising is the fact that, at least last I checked, Florida was pretty decisive. Florida, Ohio ended up being pretty decisive. I guess Ohio was something that was a must-have for Trump, but at least unless the numbers have changed, I saw about an 8-point margin, which was close to what it was last time. But trying to pull up what the actual polling averages were in advance.
And why don't we take that opportunity to go to that? I'm going to pull up, and these are numbers that are not real time. I pulled these together about an hour ago, but if you can see them, this is showing for all the battleground states what the average of the 538 polling composite was for each state. This is expressed as the Biden lead. So positive numbers mean Biden's ahead. Negative numbers, like in Texas, Iowa, showed a Trump lead, albeit a narrow one. This column here is the actual results, as reported by the AP currently, or again, as of an hour ago. Some of these are not super representative. Pennsylvania, for instance, is showing Trump with a 10-point lead, but obviously that's expected to contract significantly as they count the remainder of the vote. So we've kind of started that one, taken out of the average. But if you can see, this final column over here shows the error. The polling error if these popular vote margins tallies do hold, and they're enormous. These are sorted from the smallest error, or in one case a pro-Trump error, to the largest pro-Biden error, and they average 5.1 percentage points, which is absolutely enormous. We talked yesterday about if you were to wake up today and have a Trump win or a neck and neck dogfight, what would it mean? Would it mean that the pollsters simply had, in their tweaking of the 2016 methodology, done something that made things worse? Would it mean you had a shy Trump voter contingent out there that was actually significant, or something else? But we can get into speculating in terms of what did account for it. But just in terms of sizing it, again, nationally, we don't know exactly what the national popular vote margin will wind up as. Using the current predicted multi-outcome market on the popular vote margin, it looks like it'll be a little bit north of 4%, maybe even close to 4.5%. But say it's 4.4%, that's a national whiff of 4 points, compared to 2016, which we all talk about as, how could the polls have gotten it so wrong in 2016? And nationally, they didn't actually get it that wrong in 2016. It was just over a point that they overcredited Clinton with. The pollsters did. This year with a 4 times as large polling error nationwide, and in these critical battleground states even larger, and more than 5% polling error. Again, this is ignoring this large one in Pennsylvania from our average. This was a colossal polling error. Even if it winds up that Biden does pull it out and they still directionally get it right, the yes, Biden won. this is material. I mean, this is not simply they got it wrong around the edges. They missed a small demographic that was well correlated in the Rust Belt and enough to move enough electoral votes away from Clinton. This is something. I mean, you look, these states have very little to do with each other demographically and regionally, geographically, and these errors are enormous. So again, revisiting the question that we talked about last night, if you were to wake up today and see that the polls were fundamentally way off, what would it mean? What does it mean? Do you have any better sense?
Well, I think that this is what, I've been talking about for a while now, and what we talked about yesterday is that there's the two best explanations, and what I think is certainly I said this before all of this came out, and I think it still holds up, was that the two best explanations for the deviation between the polls and the prediction markets was that the markets were pricing in either extreme uncertainty due to the pandemic or mail-in voting and all of that, and that uncertainty still exists in terms of how the ballots are getting counted, but more likely just a belief that the polls were systematically skewed, and that the polls actually showed Biden ahead by more than he would eventually end up. And there was a question by somebody yesterday, well, couldn't the bias of the polls or the skewness of the polls go completely in the other direction? And in fact, it's going to look like Biden, beats his polling projections by several percentage points. And that, as we discussed, certainly possible, but wasn't really, to me, the plausible explanation, because what is it in, I guess, as somebody who lives here in the country, right? What is it that would suggest that there is a 8-10 point shift, 8 to 10 point change in voting preference over the course of 4 years when you have an incumbent? That's just, it's certainly possible, but you would need, I would think, a real explanation for why that would be the case, and there really just wasn't one, except for that the polls were saying that there was.
Right.
I mean, so what it means is, there was a systematic bias. If these numbers hold up, systematic bias in the polls. Mm-hmm. What it means is that the polls who said that we corrected for the things we got wrong in 2016, maybe they did correct for those things, but there's always, or maybe they didn't, but even if they did, there's always the possibility that there's something else you're missing. And so that very well may have happened.
I'm going to share this tweet from Robin Hanson earlier this morning, the GMU professor and notable prediction market enthusiast. He says, in general, when someone had a failing and then tells you they've learned their lesson so it won't happen again, they quite often haven't actually learned the lesson, and it will happen again. Seems that was the case for U.S. presidential election pollsters. And I mean, I have to tend to agree. Obviously, they got a lot of grief for 2016, even though the magnitude was not that huge of the error. The fact that it was consequential in terms of identifying who the winner would be meant there was a lot of focus on fixing whatever kind of systemic error might be there. And obviously we were assured that, yes, we do more sort of education-based weighting and things that to try and capture what they missed in 2016. But if anything, they've made things much, much worse, right? Or maybe they did fix that small problem, but as you put it, there's something larger lurking that they missed. So maybe that's pandemic specific, maybe that's Trump specific, maybe it doesn't mean that polling is effectively useless or even a counter indicator. But to me, this spells a real reckoning for the general polling industry, right? I mean, this goes it kind of validates everyone who says, ignore the polls and go vote. I mean, obviously that's good advice one way or another, but polls are, of course, what we use as the, our predominant input to our expectations. It's what all of the professional data journalists and election modelers use as their, almost exclusively, in some cases exclusively, for their forecast inputs. And so if we can't rely on these polls, and demonstrating that you can't rely on them doesn't require believing in some conspiracy that the pollsters are all in the tank for Biden or for one party or another. But it's just demonstrably the case here that they were off, in some cases a multiple of their margin of error. It's not simply a sampling error or statistical error. They're missing something fundamental here. And again, maybe years from now, retroactively, that you look back and say, yes, it was a Trump thing, it was a pandemic thing, it was a migration away from landlines things to online and other ways of capturing voter sentiment. But I think very safe to say that the polling methodology on a national basis is broken.
Well, I think that it could say it could say all of those things, but I think that overall, the polls could come back and could correct for things, at some point down the line. But I think that this really points out that what it is that you talk about using statistical analysis or some kind of data analysis to try to get some kind of forecasting insight. What it is that goes into that practice. The data point, the polls are one data point. And being a statistician, or I guess a political bettor, but a statistician primarily is where I'm coming at it from. You don't just fit a model and then just believe. It doesn't just mean you believe every data point you get and you think that that's just the ground truth and you move on and you proclaim it to be correct. You can use the model, you fit the model to the data, you get a certain answer. And in this case, we actually had two data points. We had what the polls were telling us, we had what the prediction markets were telling us. And like I said yesterday, that one thing that in betting, especially that's normal to do, it's kind of common sense after a while, is you come up with a number that you believe, maybe it is 90% Biden in the case of 538's projection. Then you look at the market and see 60 cents for Biden. And what that usually means is that the truth lies somewhere in between. And it usually lies, if the markets are efficient, even if you're pricing in, even if your model is directionally giving some good information, processing information efficiently, most of the shrinkage ends up going towards the market price. And so the 60-90 split might end up landing you somewhere in the 65 to 70% range. And so I think what the bottom line is, polls are just one data point, and there's no reason that they should be, there's no reason to expect that they would hold all of the answers. There's other information out there. It seems to me that the markets were pricing that information in. Did they do it exactly correctly in terms of whether their price was sharper than 538? That remains to be seen. That's part of the analysis that I'm doing in assessing the accuracy of the polls, or the accuracy of the poll aggregators, in particular 538, versus the accuracy of the prediction markets, and that won't be known until all the dust settles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously eager to see that analysis. I'm just going to pull up the predicted map once again, though, on that point of who got it more right or less wrong. 538, and we say 538, but just sort of as the placeholder for the professional forecasters and data journalists of the world writ large, likewise Predictit we use as sort of the stand-in for prediction markets on the whole. But again, if you look at this map that's currently showing 290 for Biden, 248 for Trump, this is exactly the map that Predictit has had as kind of its default base case map. Again, Arizona would tip back and forth sometimes, North Carolina would tip back and forth sometimes. But state by state, 50 out of 50, this has been the base case that traders have been saying to watch for. Now, this may not be where things wind up.
Well, traders, I should say.
But it's pretty close.
The market's been saying that, although a lot of individual traders have actually been saying
that's right. When you talk to individual traders, they'll say, no, several of these are safe Biden states, and you're an idiot if you don't just, take the dumb MAGA money away from them. But this is the market's been saying this is what we should expect. And so whether it turns out to be exactly right or not, it's qualitatively better, I think, forecast than one that says Biden is an absolute lock, a high 90% lock, and he's likely to get 350 or more electoral votes. That spells a real blue wave, maybe not tsunami level, but a real blue wave that would have meant likely taking back the Senate. Instead, we're seeing a Senate map that looks like the GOP winds up with 52 seats. Here we're seeing 90% chance they hold the Senate, and a gain in the House of 4 or 5 seats for for Republicans. So again, it's a qualitatively less wrong, I think, kind of forecast that that only the markets were giving you. So that doesn't necessarily imply a certain better insight. It can simply be that, wow, that no one really could have reasonably seen this. And it's just that the markets do have this sort of blind, dumb, pro-Trump, pro-Republican bias and ideology among the sort of median trader. But I don't know, you can only use that excuse for so long. If you're right, you're right. If you're wrong, you're wrong. And again, that's where your really kind of quantitative evaluation of the relative performance of the markets and the models will be so important, because there it's not simply binary, and it's not simply how close did you come to the electoral vote split, but you'll have the relative performance not only, in all the 50 states, but in 435 House races and 30 some Senate races too. So you'll be able to look at those probabilistic forecasts across hundreds of different data points and say, okay, how well was one method versus the other, the modeling method versus the market method, doing at generating those probabilistic forecasts. Do you have any sort of, I know you're still churning through a lot of data and the data isn't even all in yet, but do you have any early indications of how that's shaking out? We looked yesterday a little bit at those charts that showed the hypothetical performance, the ROI of a 538 driven model if it had invested in the various predicted markets. Do you have any sense of how that looks today compared to yesterday?
Yeah, I can, and I can show you that in a second. If I can share my screen, I pulled together some numbers before we jumped on, but I want to just mention two things, which is it looks, I suppose, although I don't know what number Biden ends up at if he runs the table on the remaining states. But let's say if he does, then obviously it's much more in the direction of where the forecaster said. If he doesn't, it's somewhere in between. But to a counterpoint to all of this would be to say, well, to say that an event is 90% likely to happen includes winning by a small margin, right? So it doesn't mean that you're a 90% favorite, you always win. You always win by a landslide, right? So that's where I think that to kind of cut through a lot of that noise, the analysis that I'm doing is to just have a metric right ahead of time and to say, well, you could win by a small margin, you could win by a large margin, but how did you actually perform on a market by market basis against the prediction prices? And so that's what we're looking at. As far as the point about that, whether the markets are overwhelmingly conservative and biased towards Republican, is that true? Or well, based on the argument that none of this was foreseeable, those who were kind of saying that Trump was either not as big of an underdog as not as big an underdog as the poll said, or just predicting that he was going to win outright, were biased. If you think about something else that happened earlier this year, the virus, the same people, or I don't know if they were exactly the same people, a lot of the same people were relying on the data for the coronavirus back in February. There's no evidence that the virus is transmissible between people. There's no evidence that you can spread the disease when you're not actually showing symptoms. This was all stuff that was said, and there was no evidence for that. But there wasn't, so it's kind of this reliance on data that either doesn't exist and taking that to mean something substantive, like the evidence that, or the lack of evidence that a silent Trump vote exists, means that it doesn't exist, is one of the big fallacies here. And I think that's a lesson, at least something to consider. So I would say that on both of those points, I said it earlier yesterday, I'll say it again today, I don't forecast elections. I haven't analyzed data on elections. I don't know anything about epidemics either. But I do know that when you look at a situation, where are the sources of uncertainty? Where are the sources of potential bias? And in the case of this election, there were plenty of reasons to foresee the uncertainty and to foresee the potential for bias. And I think that that's a very rational thing to have seen in the markets. And I think that that's actually what was happening. If I could share my screen here, I just have a really quick thing that I tried to put together here in terms of where does my analysis stand in terms of what this is all based on 538 versus predicted. So nothing that I do is live in kind of in game, if you want to think about it. Once the votes start rolling in, I'm not pitting 538 versus predicted there because, well, for two reasons. One, 538 is not actually updating its model, so it would be pretty unfair after Trump wins Texas and 538 still has Biden at 30% to win Texas or whatever they gave, buying up Biden to win Texas. That wouldn't really be fair. The other reason is that it wouldn't even be possible in practice because predicted crashed. And
right.
I mean, that's another story kind of operationally. Can we rely on markets to actually provide us information in real time, which is where they would be the most useful. And based on what we're seeing, based on what happened last night and what has happened for every election cycle in recent memory, that's not the case. But what we have here is the predicted price before the election. This was I just picked off a day or two before the election. This is just a snapshot, just a quick kind of thing. And these are on some key states that these are listed as probably the battleground states for the most part. In our portfolio, so the way that our analysis works is we assume that 538 has a forecast. They buy shares of either Trump no or Biden yes based on Trump no, Trump yes, Biden no, or Biden yes contracts based on how their forecasts match up to the market. In all of these key states, 538 was more bullish on Biden and more bearish on Trump. And so the breakdown is that they end up buying no contracts on Trump and yes contracts on Biden. That's just the way that it worked out, is that in every one of these states, they were pro-Biden. They were skewed towards Biden, I should say. So here is kind of what the value of what they paid for it, if you think of them buying all of these shares just before the election, and this is the current value of these shares, at least this was the current value as of maybe an hour or two ago. These have probably changed, especially in places like, I don't know, Georgia, potentially Nevada, whatever. And this is the current value of those holdings. So you can look at this. As of now, they paid, or as of the time I made this, they paid 7,900, and the value was 8,600. So actually, they were up very slightly. If you look at the states that have kind of been called, and you can kind of play a little bit of a game here, then their portfolio would be down 500, 529, but there's still a lot that remains to be seen. So I don't know, what's the current call on Georgia, for example? So Georgia's blue as of this second, Georgia went red now. So if we just go through and we put in the so-called most likely outcome based on what the markets are saying, then Georgia goes to Trump, North Carolina goes to Trump, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin goes to Biden, Nevada goes to Biden. It's a 400. It's a small win for these states for 538. But if you flip any one of those states, pretty much, and in particular, maybe it'll be Pennsylvania, that's a loss. And so it's really on the razor's edge in terms of how the performance goes on these battleground states. And so we'll have to see what happens. I haven't looked at the Senate or the House yet. When we look at that, we're gonna get more information, because at the end of the day, like we said before, this is one race. All of these states are to some extent correlated, as we can see here. 538 was heavy on Biden in all of these states. They didn't give Trump, and whereas the markets were favoring Trump. So to some extent, as the general election goes, each of these states is going to go. But there is some wiggle room depending on the exact electoral breakdown.
Yeah. We have a question here in the chat. This gets back to a little bit what we were talking about earlier in terms of having a large data set here to play with now as these various states resolve. The question is, for a single event like this, what is the use of spending time evaluating models and also trading analysis? Traders can get one idea right, but it can be random luck, not skill. In other words, not a big enough sample size to really evaluate this problem. But again, to the point we were discussing earlier, that's not really the case, right? I mean, you do have a pretty large sample size to look at.
Well, you could get luck. You have almost as big of a sample size as you can kind of ask for almost in the case of elections, because you only have an election every couple of years, and there's House, Senate, and president. If we were just looking at you can think of it this way: if we were just looking at the presidency and we were just looking at the one question, who wins, Trump or Biden, then the probabilities that you assign to them wouldn't affect our trading analysis at all, because you either were more pro Biden, more bullish on Biden than the markets, or less. And then that means if Biden wins, you win. If Biden loses, you lose. You take that, you try to make that a little more refined by looking at the state by state level. That's still just one presidential race, which only happens every 4 years. So you take it to the Senate, you take it to the House. There's more data to kind of go off of. But of course, it's always true that in any finite sample, whether it's an election or if you're betting on horse races, you can get lucky over over a relatively long sample, a sample size 1,000, 2,000. But what other way do you have to go on is my starting point. You have kind of a well-defined market. It's very clear what the market is and how it operates in terms of, I put up my money, you put up your money, and that's what this price means. It's less clear what the 538 numbers actually mean if you really start to think about it. And so by trying to connect the two, we try to give some meaning to what these forecasts actually are. What use do they have? I guess that's a question you can ask yourself, why does anybody read 538? I don't know. But that's kind of part of what for those who care about those things, then this is trying to evaluate how reliable, how accurate are they. And I should say that's not really been done. People will link to the 538 grading our work, checking our work page, where they actually try to they evaluate, they try to assess themselves based on all of their different. Let me see if I can pull it. I could pull this up right now just to give you a visual on this. Let's see here. So where am I?
This is going to be the 538's kind of internal, how we grade ourselves / how you should grade us kind of methodology.
Exactly. And I just have too many windows open, but I have it up. I just can't share it. I'm trying to figure out. But the basis basically. So if you look at this, and if I can figure out where it actually is on my screen, I'll show it to you. But if you look at this, they one of the things they do is they compare themselves not just for politics, but also for everything, for their sports predictions, for all of that stuff. And the first kind of red flag is that if you see how they actually come out ahead in sports forecasting, which anyone who looks at anyone who has any idea, and here it is, I think did I show the wrong thing? No, I think it was here actually, but it's supposed to show this. Is that working?
Yeah, I see your share. Someone in the chat saying at the very bottom with the quote, "We made this." There's a link to methodology.
Okay. Well, anyway, I don't know. So I'm showing you what's on the 538 site here, how they evaluate their forecast. I'm just pointing at this. They're grading themselves based on something called a Breyer score, which we don't need to get into. And they do it for NBA, they do it for World Cup, they do it for all of these things. And they are, by their account, better than a so-called unskilled forecaster in all of these things. The problem is twofold. Who is the unskilled forecaster? The unskilled forecaster is somebody who assigns a 50% to equal probability to all possible outcomes. So when it comes to predicting who was going to win California yesterday, the unskilled forecaster said Trump was 50%, Biden was 50%. So it's not too hard to beat that person at that game. And if you look at sports, they're actually a little bit better than this unskilled 50-50 forecaster at baseball, but very barely. But if you kind of look at how they do sports, they're actually very bad at sports. If you compare how what their predictions are to what ends up happening. They're much better at politics, but one of the reasons that could skew this is what I just said. they're always comparing to a 50-50 projection, even in races that everybody knows. You don't have to know very much to say that Biden's going to win California. So there's kind of it's a little bit of a straw man in that regard. And so that's where, to the extent that you care that these forecasts actually mean anything or give any indication, comparing it against a forecaster or an opponent, in our case, the prediction market, that in principle should be pricing in and should be doing a good job at aggregating this information, seems to me to be the fair competitor. And then the question becomes, who's doing better at processing the information? And that's exactly what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that idea of the unskilled forecaster, I guess much more so even than sports, you would expect that, because obviously, everyone's kind of aware of the 8, 10, or whatever, how many states you want to include in the presidential battleground. But more so if they're trying to score themselves on House races, you've got a battleground that's maybe 10%. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of House races that anyone can beat the unskilled forecaster on. That you can go nearly 100%, nearly 400 for 400 if you just, excuse the actual contested battleground.
Well, the one thing that I noticed as part of thinking about this, I looked into, who would be an actual unskilled forecaster? What would be a more kind of palatable unskilled forecaster? And in a presidential election, if you just take you have 50 states plus Washington, D.C. If you just assume, or you just assign and predict the same party for each state, you say that the party that's going to win this is the same as who won it 4 years ago. How would you do on a year-to-year basis? And if you look at that over the course of the past several election cycles, in the case of 2012, Obama-Romney, you would have predicted 49 states correctly. And remember, one of the things that I think Silver was heralded for was predicting 50 out of 50 states correctly in 2012. So you would have been using no information. You would have been using information that was 4 years old, no poll information, and you can pick 49 states correctly based on that alone.
Right.
And so who's actually, to be really good at this, to actually add value. The question is, all the work that you put into this, all the models, all the data, to add value is really on the margins at this point, because especially when you're trying to compare it to prediction markets, it's going to be hard, I think, to show that you're adding an extreme amount of value over and above kind of what people can already see for themselves.
Yeah.
That's one of the purposes of doing the analysis.
Yeah, and I think on that same point, and this is something that I genuinely don't want to make this too sort of 538 bashing, and those that follow us on Twitter may find that to be not credible statement, but I really don't. But to belabor this just a bit more, one of the things that Silver often uses to sort of clobber prediction markets is saying, look, they have access to my forecast. So if they can't do better than my forecast, then it proves there's no information in prediction markets whatsoever. Counter argument is that, okay, well, he uses almost exclusively polling, some economic fundamentals as well, but polling is the primary input. So if he can't do better than the pollsters, then what information value is he adding? It's just sort of a slightly curated aggregation of the polls. The difference between 49 and 50 is maybe not huge, but it's something. You have to know which of those 50 to flip over. But here again, this is why this cycle may prove something different, because prediction market pricing generally was not simply a reflection of the Silver and other data journalism forecasts this year. It was qualitatively different. So there was information in the prediction market pricing. It could have turned out to be bad information, and so that the prediction markets this cycle, rather than not only not adding good information, detracted from the otherwise sort of best of breed forecast. But if the opposite turns out to be true, that there was information in those price signals that wasn't in the polling and wasn't in the best of breed, much heralded, constantly cited in the press, huge big data analytical forecasts deriving their predictions from those polls, among other things, then that kind of proves out a little bit of this sort of fundamental premise that those of us involved with prediction markets are drawn to, this idea that they can more malleably synthesize a broad range of data, whether it's polling economic data or more intangibles. And again, one of the sources of risk around any confident forecast going into this election cycle that we discussed here yesterday, we've discussed it on our videos and podcasts and Twitter feeds sort of ad nauseum the last few weeks, as the forecasters have been getting more and more confident, and the prediction markets have kept Trump's chances better, and those two universes have continued to diverge more and more. One of the things that we've been pointing to is that simply in a year like this, where it comes to be cliched to say, 2020, whatever crazy thing's going to happen is whatever the craziest possible thing to happen is the thing that'll happen. But there's some truth to the idea that in this cycle where traditional campaigning, traditional canvassing was out the window, all due to pandemic and related shutdown and public health measures, it became harder to predict how virtually anything would go. Even a couple months ago, whether we'd have an election on November 3rd, but certainly what turnout rates would be, what mail ballot return rates would be. The impact of Biden suspending just the door knocking and ground game in the field canvassing for a number of weeks. We haven't had a historical precedent in the modern political era to show what impact that has, especially when you've got sort of clean dividing lines in terms of how the campaigns were approaching. Trump full steam ahead, tens of thousands of people at rallies. Biden the sort of more virtual campaign, and clean dividing lines in terms of how people plan to vote, early or by mail versus among the Trump supporters much more in person. So that doesn't necessarily say, oh, these are all pro-Trump variables, pro-Trump factors, and so you should ratchet up any poll-driven forecast to favor Trump. But I think it does generally just add largely unmodelable, but still significant uncertainty. And so to the extent any traditional poll-driven forecast that you're working with is telling you, hey, 90%, 95%, even if you don't know by what factor, you need to dial that back to that truly unskilled forecast of, nope, it's kind of 50-50, right? It's a roughly 50-50 nation. You've got two major candidates and two major parties. If you didn't know anything, you'd put it at 50-50. And so to the extent that comes into play, I think I don't know. I guess hindsight is 2020, although we said this with foresight before the fact that any of these super confident forecasts were simply failing to understand how significant just the general chaos, and not the Trump stealing or the cheating or the rigging, but just the unmodelability of so many key factors that if they're off by just a bit, could have massive impact. So again, it's a long way of making the same point, this sort of general premise of information markets being able to synthesize and better distill very disparate, often very qualitative sources of information, will await your more thorough analysis. But I think tentatively, it's that premise has been validated.
So quite a few things to say on that. The first is that to the last point, the one of the arguments or one of the hypotheses prior to yesterday was the reason why The Economist was 96% Biden. In particular, giving a justification saying that they are specifically not pricing in the notion of a stolen election on the side of Trump. Now, no one's to say that still isn't in the cards of whatever that means to steal an election is still possible. That's still possible, of course. But what we saw with those national polls, the 4% shade in the direction of Trump from the election, from the polls to the election, that's what the markets were pricing in. That's the much bigger explanation for what the markets were pricing in. And to the extent that they priced in this notion of a stolen election at all, which I guess you should always price it in on both sides, then it was there. But I think it was a much smaller number than to say that it accounted for the 30% discrepancy. As I said yesterday, that's ridiculous. On the point of but not like, as you said, not bashing any of these modelers. I actually put out a number of things the day or two before the election with respect to what it is that I'm trying to get at by comparing in this case, 538. We hope to add the economists to our analysis, and basically anyone else who has forecast, we'll add them to our analysis if the data is in a usable form. I actually have a lot of respect for the way that they do the statistics, in the sense that I think that if I actually were to try to do this myself, I would have probably ended up in about the same spot as far as my forecast based on polls alone, assuming I did it right, and I used the same information. I'm going to end up using a lot of the same methods. This is just kind of standard practice. It's not easy to do. There's a lot of practical issues and hurdles to overcome, and manpower you need. But at the end of the day, if you were to just process the polls, you'd end up at that 90% number or thereabouts. So I don't dispute that number is a fraudulent analysis or a horrible analysis. What I did dispute, and what I still dispute, is that's the whole story. That's part of the story. And so, but at the end of it, ultimately though, what is the goal in trying to talk about any of this isn't to kind of point fingers as who was right and who was wrong, but before the fact, I should say, I posted my paper a week or two ago before the election happened, and I said, this is how I'm going to evaluate this thing. And that's really important. Generally, in any scientific thing, it's called practice. It's called pre-registration. You pre-register the method you're going to use before you see the data, because once you see the data, you can kind of go and say, well, yeah, I got this point, I got this right, or I got that right, and you can kind of cherry pick. And so avoiding post hoc analysis is one of the things that I think is important here. And that's the thing that I believe 538 is a huge offender in that regard. And so I don't question their statistical abilities. I question the way they present it, especially after the fact. And so having a concrete metric, I think, is important. The last thing I'll say on the notion of uncertainty and polling uncertainty and how to kind of account for this, especially in the world of the pandemic, and the question yesterday of, well, maybe there's a polling error and Biden's going to win by even more than the polls say. That's all possible, but one thing to bear in mind, that assumes that the uncertainty and the error is symmetric, and that's how standard statistical errors in kind of classical statistics, you assume a symmetric distribution on the errors. My experience tends to be, and this is kind of more of a rule of thumb than anything else, when there's uncertainty and you're in a good position, when you're in a good position and there's uncertainty, the uncertainty always makes you worse off. It doesn't make you better off, right? If Biden wins if he's going to win by 100 electoral votes, winning by 200 electoral votes doesn't do him any favors. But the uncertainty could skew him in the direction of winning 200, but more likely the uncertainty is because the reason in the first place that we're putting him as such a favorite is that we're uncertain about something that actually is maybe more in Trump's favor, or squeezes things more towards the middle. And we're maybe assuming that uncertainty is more symmetric than it actually is. So just as a rule of thumb that I use is that when you're in a good position, usually only bad things can happen. And I think that was possibly true of Clinton in 2016 and Biden in this year, although Biden, of course, can still win and is favored to win. But just talking generically about the forecasts and the numbers and whether it should have been closer to 90 cents or 60 cents, I think those types of considerations come into play.
Yeah. And, I see we're getting up close to the hour mark, so we're going to let these fine folks go in just a couple of minutes. But you were talking a little bit about sort of your research philosophy and pre-registration and kind of setting your benchmarks, your metrics ahead of time. We did get one other question here in the chat to do with your sort of overarching philosophy towards research and the academic process. And the question is asking about your ideas for market peer review for scientific research. I know that's sort of at the core of the work that you do at researchers.one. So for our viewers' sake who may not be familiar with that organization, can you tell them a bit about that and how it sort of comports with your philosophy of peer review?
Well, just generally speaking, Researchers One is a platform that I co-founded, and it's a place currently you can post articles on there and get them openly peer reviewed. Anybody can go and make comments, say that this is right, this is wrong. It's in that sense decentralized. Of course, there's a site, but it's not controlled by anybody. Nothing has to kind of go through any kind of gatekeeping. So it has a feel as far as research is concerned. It has more of an open and arguably market based kind of philosophy, in that it's kind of like a marketplace for ideas. And anybody who's listening right now can read my paper, and can comment on what they think it might be missing or how it could be improved, or anything like that. But yes, as a general philosophy, the belief, one of the arguments for prediction markets, and I argue, completely independent of markets, but kind of just in general research, is that the highest quality signal comes when you have openness in terms of who can participate and where the information can come from. And that's very much kind of counter to how actual academic research and publishing works. And so I think prediction markets are actually a really good domain to look to, not just for buying and selling contracts, which is what they actually do, but some of the philosophy underlying that, the idea that the idea that this market mechanism aggregates information more effectively and more efficiently, provided that you have enough participants. That's among the ideas that we are integrating into our platform. We have a lot coming down the pipe in terms of new features. And we're also very interested in prediction market projects and prediction markets in general, trying to publish research in ways that would help in the better design and operation of these markets. And to the extent that we can contribute in that fashion, we're very interested and eager to do so.
Oh, it's fantastic, and I encourage everyone to follow along with Harry's research. You can check out that platform at researchers.one. You can follow Harry on Twitter at Harry D. Crane. Thanks, Harry, for being with us and helping it to sort of break this down. This is still a lot of dust to settle, so I'm sure we'll be doing more of these. If you've enjoyed this installment, please make sure to subscribe to the channel while you're here. You can also hit that little bell notification to make sure next time we go live. It may be kind of spur of the moment as things are breaking, so you will be sure not to miss a minute. You can also follow us on Twitter. We are at Old Bull TV, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Harry, thanks again. Great chatting with you, and look forward to seeing your analysis of all this.
Yeah, thanks a lot.